Welcome, dear friends. Welcome to Ray of God. Bismillah. We begin in the name of that one, out of whose womb of compassion and mercy all things emerge. Thank you for joining us for this continuing Ray Read session. Ray seeks to share feminine spiritual wisdom to help realize God in all ways and to align with justice, truth, and beauty. The energetic state of the feminine is our guiding principle and holds our intention. And we believe that all genders hold the feminine and masculine within themselves. While we are women-led and women-centered, we welcome and encourage all genders to join us in helping to create safer, more inclusive spaces, God willing. So this month we continue our book chat with A Treasury of A'ishah, a guidance from the beloved of the beloved by Dr. Sofia Rehman. And I'm just going to read a little bit of the blurb. Aisha bint Abu Bakr has been an inspiration and paragon for Muslims since the first generation of believers emerged. Hailed as a guiding light, a fount of wisdom and a purveyor of the prophetic mission, Aisha's words have illuminated Islamic thought in all its branches. And this book compiles 40 of her insights and statements with commentary for the contemporary Muslim seeking spiritual and moral direction as they traverse through daily life and its challenges and possibilities. And as you can see, this is such a beautiful, petite book. It's, it's all small, handbag sized. You can take it with you when you're traveling, when you're going out. But don't think that it's petite inside. There is so much that is crammed in here and shared, and I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming back Sofia, who joined us for Rayfest last year. Welcome, Sofia. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Saima, for having me back, for letting me be part of this beautiful community that you have nurtured and nourished. And thank you to everybody who's joining us this evening.
Yeah, it's lovely to have all these friends joining us as well. I always say that I won't try to dominate the conversation with all my questions, so do feel free to post your questions in chat, and perhaps later if you'd like to come on camera as well, we can have you share your reflections directly with Sofia. So, as I said, I always have lots to say, but Sofia, let's begin with, first of all, how this lovely little pocket of wisdom arrived in its form as we have it today.
So I love that you called it, a small but powerful, and that's something that I keep hearing. The more book events I'm doing, people will often introduce it as small but mighty, and I really love that. And that's why I love it so much is the fact that people are recognizing it as something mighty and powerful, but also it's the way that my husband describes me. So I just think it's really nice that my first book in the world sort of reflects who I am as a person, hopefully, and I hope in more ways than just its physical manifestation. But the journey to writing, yeah. So the journey to writing this book really began towards the end of 2019. So I was just finishing off my PhD, which was itself very much focused on Aisha bint Abu Bakr. It is a critical study of a 14th century text by Imam al-Zarkashi. It's called al-Ijaba. In that text, Imam al-Zarkashi collected over 200 narrations of Aisha's where she was correcting, refuting, and sometimes corroborating primarily male companions and their statements that they had attributed to Aisha. So I was drawing to the end of my PhD. I think I was on the verge of submitting, or I had submitted, but it was around the time that, I was coming out of that PhD tunnel. And I was, sitting around having brunch with my husband, and we were talking about the Cube Treasury series. So this is actually part of a series called, the Treasury series, run by Cube Publishers. And essentially the idea is that each book is a collection of 40 statements on a given topic or by a particular individual. And my husband, who is also a scholar of Islam and who had done his PhD on Ibn Taymiyyah, had already contributed a book to the series on 40 statements of Ibn Taymiyyah. So I was saying to my husband that this is an incredible series, I think, in terms of raising, you know, sort of setting the standard in Islamic Islamic publishing. It, you know, set the bar quite high. But I said there's this almost screaming lack of diversity, right? There's nothing written by a woman. There's nothing written on women. It's just this massive gaping gap in this series, and I'm going to rectify that. And I said, I'm going to get in touch with Cube and I'm going to put forward a proposal, and, you know, with one stone I'm going to knock out two birds, right? And you know how they say, you know, from your mouth to Allah's ears, right? It was as if that happened in that moment, because we finished our brunch, we put away our stuff, and then he went off to do his work and I went off to do my work, and I opened my laptop and there was an email from well, at the time he was a colleague of mine. He was also doing his PhD in the same department as myself, but he had also been working for Cube Publishing, and he had reached out and said, would you contribute to the Treasury series on the statements of Aisha? I was just blown away. I felt very humbled in that moment that, oh, here I was not 20 minutes ago complaining to my husband about this lack and how I was going to go and fill that up. And I opened my laptop and there was this message. So after that, he just asked me to sort of put together a proposal that we could, you know, present to Cube. And I pretty much did that within an hour of receiving his message, I think. And yeah, very quickly the ball got rolling. It's quite distinct from my PhD, which is also due to be published hopefully by the end of this year or beginning of next year by Oxford University Press, in that, you know, whilst it's scholarly and it's academically rigorous, it's not academically written, right? It is written for a far broader audience. Although when I wrote my PhD, I also very much wrote it with the intention that one day it would be out in the public domain and I want it to be accessible. But maybe I can come back to talk to you about that one when that one's out. And so for the Treasury of A'ishah, I did take some of the statements that I already had from my PhD, but I also spent a good year just sort of researching beyond the singular text that I'd used for my PhD. I went into various tafsirs, I went into history books, I went into hadith books, I went into books of jurisprudence, fiqh books, and I mined them for any instance in which Aisha had something a little different to say. And, you know, I found plenty of that. And yeah, and so then it didn't take me much longer after that to write the book itself. I think I only took like sort of another maybe 6 months to write the book. I feel like the editorial process took longer, you know, sort of sat with Cube for a little while before the ball really got rolling. And then, yeah, as they say, the rest was history. It was published and now here it stands in my hands and in your blessed hands, thankfully.
Oh, yes, very, very grateful to have it. You've just already touched upon two really important things. Okay, and I just love it. I knew that our conversation was going to be like this. The fact that you asked, right? You saw something that you noticed it yourself, you know, without even thinking about this is what the world needs. I need this. I want to, you know, have women contributing to this series and it to be about women. This is so powerful that sometimes we forget, right? That Allah says, ask, you know, ask. And if it is meant to be, then a way will appear. And, you know, like within you completing your brunch, the way it appeared, I just think that's so, in one sense, it seems quite miraculous, but then it's also, but everything is miraculous. You know, Allah is constantly like showing us miracles and all the signs around us. And I think our human limitation stops us from really reaching that far. And I'm so glad that you shared that, because I think it's such an important thing for all of us, regardless of our backgrounds and what we're doing, to say, you know, this is something I think, you know, I want to have or to happen. Put the intention out there and just see what comes back to you. And so goodness, amazing that you were able to do this and for this to happen. But also, in a sense, it's not really that amazing, because of course it should happen, and of course it should be out there. So I love that. And then the second thing, accessibility. You know, I'm definitely one of those people. I'm not academically inclined. I don't have an academic background, and I find it very difficult sometimes to read. I used to find it very difficult to read religious academic, you know, works, because I just would not be able to kind of get to the bottom of the page. It's got better. I don't want to attribute it to the fact that maybe I've got better at reading. I want to say it's more because the people that are writing are making things more accessible, and so it's easier to digest. But I would absolutely say this is so accessible, because you're presenting, again, the academic rigor of where it's coming from and how it's been translated. But you do it in a, you know, so many times people get caught up in, you know, let's use 10 words instead of 1. It's not always necessary to do that. And also you have then the piece, you know, that you've translated, but then really it's in the insights that you're offering that gives us a different way of approaching something. Like so many of these things I had heard before, so many I had really struggled with. But it's again in that reframing of, you know, well, how was this in the time, you know, of the Prophet and his companions, and how can we take this for the times that we're living in and continue to evolve with them? And I guess I'm going to ask, you know, one thing I just want to really highlight is the thing that I had mentioned in my review, which is how we are constantly reminded that we must engage with our critical thinking. We've been granted it for a reason. And the way that you go through this, you know, and the main ones were at the beginning, the first section, is how Aisha, you know, bless her, sometimes she doesn't give the answer. She will kind of lead the people in her community, and usually the men, to like think, okay, well, use your critical reasoning. How does this make sense? You know, how is it that women could travel, you know, to Makkah? They could travel, you know, wherever they wanted. But now we're meant to stop. And I didn't even know that she did it, you know, by herself. So, you know, you have on page 27 that she set out for her pilgrimage to Makkah without a mahram, even when she had mahrams available to her. So not only is she helping the community to use their reasoning, but she's embodying it as well. And it's such a simple and yet incredibly powerful thing to embody it, and then to show those around, oh, this is possible. And then it gets, you know, recorded, you know, in history that she did this. So if she did this at the time of, you know, Hazrat Umar of all people, if she did this, then what does that say? And let us think about these laws that have come down, you know, centuries later to limit and prohibit, you know, the full agency of women and other minorities in this way. And I guess, you know, my question then to you is, was that something that you were already aware of? Or was that something that was quite a revelation to you when you were doing this research?
Oh, what a great question. So certainly by the time I came to writing this book, I was very familiar with this. I was very familiar with the rebellious nature of Muslim women, both in the contemporary moment and historically. I suppose it was never an immense surprise, because I know from my personal experience that what drove me to this sort of research was my own inner rebellion, right? It was my own ability to say, I'm a believing woman. I have a particular understanding of who Allah is, but I am not receiving the amount of mercy nor justice that I believe my religion should be delivering to me. And that set me off on a quest, you know, which 20 years later I'm still on. And I don't think I'm unique in that. I don't think that I never had the hubris to think that I was the first and only Muslim woman to have that moment where I thought, hang on a minute, there is a disconnect there is a incongruence between what I know of Allah and what I am experiencing of Allah. I couldn't believe that I was the first woman to think that. And then, of course, as I journeyed down this path of research and questioning and seeking out women and their voices, I found that from the very moment that Islam was born, there are women who have been present, asking questions and demanding that their lived experiences be considered. And I love the way that you've relayed to everybody here how Aisha, how she herself embodied this rebellion. And it's sad that we even think of it in terms of rebellion, because actually, rebellion implies that there is a standard and we are going against that standard. And when we talk about it in the terms that we often do when it comes to Muslim women, it's almost as if we are saying that Muslim women rebel against Islam, and that is what is often the accusation that is made against Muslims. Oh, you are rebelling against Islam. No, we are not. We are rebelling against patriarchal co-optation, kidnapping of Islam, and we are rebelling against that. And so really what we're actually doing is embodying the rebellious nature of Islam itself. Okay, so when Islam was being revealed, when we look at what the Prophet ﷺ was enacting as a prophet, it is pure rebellion, right? The Prophet's first sunnah is to rebel against the traditions of his own people, wherever those traditions were unjust and cruel. And that is the rebellion, that is the sunnah that Muslim women, I believe, have upheld most greatly. And that is what I see in Aisha, it's what I've seen in Salama, it's what I've seen in women like Khawla, bint Khuwaylid. It is intrinsic, I think, in the DNA of most Muslim women. I can't say all Muslim women, but I'd like to think that it's there for most Muslim women. And Aisha, what I loved so much about her, and what did astound me, was the extent of her rebellion. And how deeply it flowed, and how she didn't give it up at any point, right? She might change tact, we see her change tact, but she never gives it up, because she sees herself as as a Khalifa of the Prophet ﷺ as well. She's also a vice regent of the Prophet ﷺ, just like Umar, Abu Bakr, Ali, Uthman. She was as well. She ran parallel, in fact, to the first Khulafa, the Khulafa Rashidin, as we refer to them as. She's almost like the string that binds them all together. She was always there, present in all of those first early leadership, first early Khulafa roles, as an advisor, as somebody who was rectifying, as somebody who was so committed to that role as protector of the legacy of the Prophet ﷺ, that she was willing to go to war. And that's what we see her doing with Ali. This isn't, often in sort of more popular depictions of that story, it's almost presented as if, oh, well, she always kind of had it in for him ever since the slander, and he suggested to the Prophet ﷺ that there are other fish in the sea. It's sort of, it's degraded and diminished to, well, she had a little bit of a chip on her shoulder when it came to Ali anyway. But it's not. It runs far deeper and far more profoundly to more important things, like the maintenance of truth and upholding justice. She did not believe that Ali was doing right by Uthman. She did not believe that Ali was bringing to justice those who murdered Uthman, and she was going to hold him to account for that, just as she had held Uthman to account for his nepotism. She wasn't, you see this consistency in her, in upholding what she believed to be the truth always, and siding with justice. And that was, yes, on this grand, sort of state level, but also in the everyday. So there's an example in the book, and I think it's the one that you may have just mentioned on page 27, where essentially, she's sitting in what is described as, you know, sort of almost an audience, and there's herself and another Sahabi, and that Sahabi is saying, oh, you know, women, you can't travel without a mahram, you know. And what I love with Aisha in that moment is that she doesn't enter into a debate with him because he's not what's important in that moment. She turns to the women that are in audience and says, not all of you has a mahram. It's that sort of Socratic way of teaching. You know, she's not going, he's made his statement. He has stated what he thinks is truth. And she's almost provoking the women in the audience by saying, hang on a minute, think about what he's just said. Think about the implications of what he's just said on your life. How are you going to go on Hajj? How are you going to go on Umrah? How are you going to visit your family that live in a different city to you? You know, what is the impact of what he is saying on your lives? And so I love this provocation from Aisha. And then, of course, you know, the whole thing is addressed, and we find her not only encouraging the women to travel without a mahram if necessary, but, you know, as you said, she embodies that herself and goes and makes Hajj and Umrah without a mahram. And of course, you know, the patriarchy has to do something with that. So, you know, there are those who will say, yeah, but, you know, all of the ummah is a mahram for Aisha, which of course is not true. It's an illogical argument to make because, of course, there are other instances in which she does not treat everyone as if they are her mahram. So, you know, there is something so important in what she illustrates of how a Muslim woman can and must ask questions from those who would present themselves as an authority over our religion. And the other thing that you spoke to, and I'd like to speak to it as well, is the fact that we do need women's interpretation. And we need the interpretation of non-binary friends as well. We need the interpretation of, you know, disabled Muslims. We need the interpretations of every single kind of Muslim that is not cisgendered male, middle class educated, because they've had the monopoly on the interpretive process. And that's fine. There's lots that's been very enriching through that interpretation, through the interpretations that they've made, through the intellectual sort of rigor that they've applied to their contribution to our intellectual heritage. But for it to be only theirs is what has caused so much pain, trouble, hurt, violence to our community. And so that has to be checked. And as you know so well, Saima, you know, we were only discussing this on Sunday, you know, the idea of difference and how essential that is to our faith. You know, we know, you know, Fatima Sidat speaks about this. She writes about this beautifully in the Women's Khutbah book, that, you know, difference is part of our ontological truth. And it is part of the very, it is the very tool that Allah has given us to know one another. You know, this is the ayah in the Quran that Allah has created us in different tribes and languages and communities and ways in order that we may get to know one another. So there is purpose, and it is a knowledge generating purpose for which Allah has created us differently. Our differences become a problem because instead of using those differences as a means to knowing one another, we use those differences to create hierarchies instead, and to pit some at the bottom of that hierarchy and others at the top of that hierarchy. And this is a you know, a satanic impulse, right? Ana khayrun minhu. This is from Satan's words. I am better than him. I am made of fire and he is made of clay. This is a satanic way of being, that one considers themselves better than another by something as material as what we are made of. So, you know, difference is essential if we are going to really embody Islam, and if we are going to bring about the mercy, the justice, the compassion into this world with which we have been made, you know, for which we have been made responsible as Muslims.
Oh, thank you so much, Sophia. I have to say, I got quite emotional when you were talking about Aisha almost being like being a Khalifa. Like, that's such an amazing way to look at her service. She was constantly in service. And like you say, she was there, you know, for the first four, you know, Khalifas, she was alongside all of them. And like you say, supporting, correcting, you know, openly, you know, arguing with things that she felt that wasn't right. I just want to read a comment that Norma sent in chat. She said that, referring to, of course, to you, Sophia, I love your recognition of rebellious women. It seems that in spite of rebellion, there is a huge sense of true Islam in the long run and doing all that women have done to advance human civilization, even when silenced and ignored. Thank you for highlighting Aisha's tenacity and passion to advance the banner of truth. Thank you so much, Norma. And absolutely. And I think that, you know, so I'll be really honest. I wasn't sure I was going to share this, but I will share it. So I think it was about maybe 12, 15 years ago, I kind of started, you know, reading about, you know, women in Islam. And I had this real block with Aisha. And, you know, I kind of was working around it, and I've always felt a real connection to Hazrat Khadija, you know, and I thought, am I doing that silly woman's thing where it's like, oh, you know, I really have this connection with the first wife and therefore I don't have this issue. But I really sat with it, and I actually asked one of my teachers, you know, I'm really feeling that there's something here for me. And he recommended that I read as many biographies and as much information about her as possible, and then sit with her, try and have this dialogue to figure out what is this block within me. And I realized it wasn't that I didn't feel a connection with her. It was that I had felt too much of a connection with her. I felt too much of a connection to the way I'd always heard her referred to when I was, you know, going to madrasa as a child. And it might be maybe they were more Khadija loving. And so there was the way that they presented Aisha. But it was the words that was used for her: feisty, rebellious, loud, all the labels that had been used against me as a child. And so it was like, oh, you know, but, you know, Hazrat Khadija was the first Muslim, and she was there for the Prophet, and she, you know, held him and covered him, and, you know, she was the best. And then there were these other wives later too. But then the more I read, it's that own, maybe an internalized, you know, that toxic femininity perhaps that we have, right? That it's always about pitting women against each other, opening it out to seeing the beauty of Hazrat Aisha, and also then connecting to almost like healing within myself these, you know, words that had been kind of, you know, lashed. You know, you feel them when people use these words in a negative way, and you think, oh, I need to make myself smaller, I need to make myself quieter. But then seeing how she used it and all the ways that you've just, you know, illustrated in how she did that. And so it had this complete turnaround to this almost like kind of trying to avoid her light, to finally being welcomed into her light and learning more about her, and then learning more about myself in that whole process. And so I just, you know, and now I think to myself, here I am, you know, almost 15 years later, having this conversation with you about this amazing mother of the believers, and to have this gem, you know, and definitely your next book, when it comes out, we will definitely speak about that. So I'm just really, really grateful for that. There's so much to think that there are so many of us, you know, and definitely in your book club, there are so many, you know, not just women, but, you know, but all people are invited to that, having these conversations and having these connections with her. So I will connect that to a question to say, as you've been sitting with her, are you, if you feel comfortable sharing, you know, what has that been like to be receiving her wisdom, not just through the sacred text that you've been exploring, but also like on a spiritual heart connection, you know, that she must be a constant companion, I imagine, and how wonderful that must be.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so it's interesting what you said about, I mean, thank you so much. I'm so glad that you did share your story this time, actually, because that was not where I thought you were going with that story. I did not think you were going to say that it's because she was too similar, you connected too much to her. But I think this is what I loved about her, and I think that is perhaps why I was drawn to her. So I never had that juxtaposition of Khadija and Aisha growing up, because I didn't have a particularly I didn't have a lot of religious teaching growing up. I had sort of just, I went to mosque, learned how to read. The imam smacked my brother one day and my mum never took us back again. So it was just that kind of, and then it was just all kind of cultural until I decided as a teenager that I wanted to learn about my religion a lot more myself. And that became quite separate from any sahabiyat. It was very rare for me to read about women. I always seemed to be reading about men. And I think that might be a reflection of the times in which I was growing up. The greatest and the most popular biography of the Prophet ﷺ at the time was The Sealed Nectar, which I can be a lot more honest about now than I was at the time. It really reduced, again, it's very reductive. It just reduced the Prophet's life to a series of battles. It just felt like, pre-Islam, there were all these battles, and then the Prophet came, and then there were all these battles, and then the Prophet died, and then there were these battles, and it was just sort of like a series of battles, before the Prophet, during the Prophet, after the Prophet. And it was just, it was very macho, very violent, very supremacist. And of course, there was very little then to be able to connect with on that. And then I read Martin Ling's biography, and that felt a little bit more humane. Excuse me. But to come back to Aisha, what I found really interesting when I was reading, texts about her, was this, again, this real attempt by scholars to sort of mold her into what the Muslimah paragon should look like. So we know that the ideal Muslimah, according to sort of patriarchal interpretations of Islam, is that she's quiet, she's demurring, she's subservient to her husband, she is modest to the point of being invisible, physically invisible, and yet that is not what Aisha is. She's not demurring, not even with the Prophet himself. We see again and again in her life, she is tenacious, and yes, she is feisty, she's intelligent, but these were the qualities that in turn were loved by the Prophet ﷺ. But it's something that I refer to in the book, because she asked so many questions, because she didn't just go, yes, husband, dearest darling, and she asked questions instead. The Prophet loved her for that, because he knew that in her asking questions, the ummah to come would be protected, because they would have more answers. So she was beloved to the Prophet ﷺ for those characteristics. And so you see this sort of wrestling that goes on between, scholars who write about her and who she is, because she is who she is, and they're trying to fit her into this mold of what they believe a Muslimah should be like. And I'll tell you a really funny sort of quick anecdote, which I think sort of reflects this experience today as well. So when my book came out, a group of my friends, they were like, come on, we have to celebrate this. So they organized a meal, and it was great. We went out, we had cake, we had food, we were talking. It was just wonderful, really beautiful evening with my female Muslim friends. And we're all really enjoying this moment, celebrating essentially Aisha as well, because I do feel like this is, I mean, but without sounding arrogant, I do hope that what my work does is allow her to be fully herself, because I am not trying to push her into a mold that she does not fit into. There are times when I read things that she said or did, and I was like, Aisha, really, hun? I was like, girl, really? You gonna do that? All right, because she's not a character of my imagination. She's not fiction, at least not in my world, right? She is a person, and I'm trying to return to her as much agency and humanity as I can. But anyway, so we're out at this meal, and the waiter who is serving us is a Muslim man, and he's been great the whole evening. He's been great. And then I don't know why one of my friends decides to tell him why we're here. Oh, I think it's because the cake came out. So he was like, oh, is it somebody's birthday? And she said, no, it's not. It's my friend. She's written this book. And my friend who's saying this, she's wearing a hijab, and I'm sitting there, no hijab. And the waiter is thoroughly confused. And instead of sort of going, oh, okay, that's interesting, or just, you know, staying professional and just saying, oh, congratulations, and moving on, he comes in real close and, you know, he says to us, do you know what Aisha's greatest quality was? So like, there's no sense of, okay, here is a Muslim woman who is, you know, she's a scholar, she's written a book on Aisha. No, he is going to tell us, you know, oh, you who's written a book of 40 statements of Aisha, let me tell you who is the most, you know, what is the most great characteristic of Aisha? So I was like, yeah, sure, go ahead. And he said, it was her modesty. It was her haya. It was her quietude. It was her barda. It was, you know, her staying covered up and not visible. And I just thought, oh, was it? And then my friend who could see that I'd switched off by this point, and I'd sort of turned to the rest of the group and gone, here we go, all right, here we go. She just offered him her own copy of her book, and she said, maybe you should just read this. But I just thought, the goodness, isn't this such a great illustration of the sort of thing that happens again and again, and it happened to Aisha herself, you know, where she was mocked sometimes, where, you know, her contemporaries were telling her, weren't you told to stay quiet and stay in your home? Weren't you told to stay quiet and stay in your home? You know, this was the accusation that she was met with again and again, especially when she started to question authority and power. When she, you know, sadly, it was Uthman radiallahu anhu, you know, with all the respect and love for him, but he was the first to hurtle that at her when she held him to account for the nepotism with which he was, you know, essentially abusing his power for. And when she did that, he said, weren't you told to be quiet and stay at home? And that was something that she heard again and again, right as she went through to the war with Ali radiallahu anhu as well, which is so sad. And we, you know, despite her position, despite the Prophet ﷺ's love for her, despite everything that she contributed to the leadership of her father Abu Bakr and then Umar, you know, not long after them, she's having to hear things like that. And then that's what I remind myself, that if Aisha could put up with that and still forge a way for Muslims, that all these centuries later we are still benefiting from her, then I can withstand a bit of that as well.
You can give a little bit of grace to the waiter who was trying to tell you, but yeah, my goodness, I was
one of many sadly, but yeah.
I was actually thinking to myself, do I have the energy to try and find the vom emoji while you were talking? And I just thought, no, I won't do that. But I actually want to come back to, you know, this really important point about humanizing these figures. You know, we talk about it a lot in the book club. You know, the more accessible material we have about these figures that humanize them, for me, you know, and I know for others too, but I'll speak for myself, it makes me love them more. And, you know, coming back to something that you said earlier, you know, that this is something that is thrown around a lot, that she, you know, went to war against Ali because she was holding on to this grudge. And you're absolutely right? They reduce it to that. And for me, like, now I've started having the conversation, which is, and so what? So what if she held a grudge against Ali? Does that mean that she's going to make this massive decision that's going to affect the entire community, you know, for time immemorial, because she's aware this is, you know, Islam survives, this is going to be something that happens? Is she going to do it because of a grudge? Because I would certainly hold that grudge. You know, I actually hold it for her. When I read about it so many times, I definitely hold that grudge. But also, she turned her back on the Prophet, you know, in that story that you tell at the end, when, you know, it was revealed that the charge of adultery wasn't true. you know, and he was having to hear all these whispers from people in the community, and he had to hold himself back as the person in charge and try to be, you know, the diplomat in that situation, rather than just racing in as the husband. But when that revelation came, you know, and I love how you put it, that when, you know, her parents prompt her to get up and go to her husband because now it's all been cleared up, she says, by Allah, I will not go to him, and I praise none but Allah. And I mean, that's so powerful, because that is a moment to show that no matter what your relationships are, don't put anyone on a pedestal, because when you have a relationship, that's between heart to heart. And if there is something there that you're upset about, be open about it, right? Don't let it fester. And I feel like with Aisha, she's a great example of somebody who didn't ever let anything fester, because she knows the harm that can cause, right? But that is when your heart starts to become clouded, is that you bring it out into the open, and you're clear about it, and you're able to talk about it as well. And so for me, all these things about, you know, well, it's not an either or. It's like I feel like she can absolutely not be happy with Ali about something that, you know, he didn't have to have an opinion about her marriage, but she can also hold him to account for something, you know, terrible. And like you say, she was, you know, Uthman's most vocal critic of what he was doing with the Ummah. But yet she was also the strongest voice that was calling for justice for him. And I feel like, you know, anybody that has, you know, and like Norma said, right, Aisha's tenacity and passion to advance the banner of truth. Anybody that takes up the banner of truth, they're never going to be received with open arms, because there's always going to be, you know, some power structure that's going to be questioned there. And yet she did that time and time again. And there are so many more, you know, amazing quotes about how she used to be a little bit annoyed with, you know, with her husband as well when certain things would happen. And to me, those little nuggets are what make her human and make her so much more beloved, because it's like, okay, this is a real human being that we can learn from and take example from. You know, when she was flawed, and, you know, but even when she was flawed, she was amazing. Again, it's not either or. It's not she was flawed in one moment and amazing in another moment. She was flawed and amazing. And I just think that's just incredibly remarkable.
Oh, I love that, Saima. I think not only does it humanize her in those moments when she's sort of having a go at her husband, but it humanizes her husband. You know, I know that through the work that I've done on Aisha, I have come to love the Prophet ﷺ more as well. And I've been able to see him for the flawed human being that he was as well, despite his lofty status as a prophet. And isn't that how we are meant to connect to our prophets? You know, does the Quran not tell us that, you know, the command, or the demand rather, for an angel to be sent as a messenger of God directly to the people is met by Allah with the response that you will get humans, right? Humans will receive humans as prophets. If you were angels, you would receive angels as prophets. And so, you know, the prophet was a human being with all the flaws that human beings have the potential to have. And he was striving as a husband and as a, you know, leader of this nascent community that suddenly grew quite quickly. And he was trying to balance that out. And in being able to see the Prophet ﷺ in that light, I know that that's helped me in being able to see my husband in a certain light. It's helped me when I've had friends come to me and complain about their husbands, or, you know, issues in their marriages, or when I've been asked to write or speak on the topic of marriage. In humanizing the Prophet ﷺ as a husband and the things that he struggled with, I've been able to find more wisdom and insight in the institution of marriage as it was played out by the Prophet ﷺ. So if we sort of whitewash him and his wives, then how do we benefit from that? You know, to remove their flaws is really to incapacitate us in being able to access the wisdoms that lie there for us. So yeah, I mean, I love the story of the slander, which sounds like a strange way to put it, but I love it because I feel like it is dripping with lessons. And sadly, we never received those lessons. So when I was growing up, the story of the slander was not something that was spoken of. It was not a story that we were told about. It wasn't ever relayed. And then the more I studied, I started to get sort of insinuations about it from different places, but still nobody would talk openly about the slander. It took a long time for me to hear about the slander in full and open terms. And I really had to go back to, sort of history books to find more detailed versions of the story. What I find interesting, and you mentioned it there about the grudge that Aisha apparently held against Ali. If you look at this history book, so if you look at Tarikh al-Tabari, which is translated into English, so if people want to go and have a look, you can. In the whole episode of the war against Ali, the Battle of the Camel, and the run up to it, there are lots of times in which Aisha is told, you were supposed to stay silent and stay at home. You were commanded to stay at home. Actually, one of the accusations that never comes up is you're only doing this because you held a grudge against Ali. Nobody actually says that. So in the early histories, that's actually not an accusation that is leveled against her. That comes up later on in history. Later historians sort of weave that in as a possible motive for Aisha's going to war with Ali. So again, that is also a simplification of an interpretation of her motivations by male scholars. I don't necessarily believe that if more women had been involved in that historiography of that story, that accusation would have come up, or if it had, I think it would have been rebutted a lot more robustly than it had been at the time. It's certainly something that I don't pay attention to. I agree with you. It could have been there. It could be that there's this sour taste that remains. But for me, she's a woman that between the time of the slander and the Battle of the Camel, so much has happened. She's grown as a woman. She's had so much input into the direction of the Ummah, both in terms of its spirituality, in terms of its education, and in terms of its policies. So this is a woman who is so far away from the girl who was embroiled in the slander that I would be surprised if she even ever thought of Ali and that moment again. I really think that it would have just been a speck, a dot in the moment of her glorious life. And to think that maybe 20 years later, she was still brewing over that statement of Ali's, please. The Prophet ﷺ loved her. He called out for her. He wanted to die in her arms, and that's where he did die. There was no question of his love or the notion of other fish in the sea to replace her beyond that moment of the slander and when Allah exonerated her from it. So I really just do not believe that, she was harboring some sort of resentment still against Ali. I really believe that, and I think that the literature indicates that it was a case of upholding justice. And I'm all for that. I will, that is where all the evidence places Aisha for me.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that there isn't anything in the early texts about this being brought up. I think that's actually really quite important for those who do use that argument to say that, this is what it is, because if the people during the time and then the time after who were looking at it, with much more immediacy, because it wasn't that long ago, if they weren't able to come up with it, then maybe there's some particular person later on that had some personal issues that just needed to throw that in there, and that's what jumped on. We are coming to the end of our time, but since we are talking about the slander, which I also agree is incredibly important, I wanted to just read out Roshni's comment, and maybe we could close with this. And she says that the last chapter, which is a very, very important lesson for a lot of women, the last chapter which is a very, very important lesson for a lot of women. Did you plan to include it from the very beginning? Could you talk about the thought process and research that went behind it? I think you've kind of answered this, a lot of this around it, but if there's anything extra that you want to add.
Yeah, from the beginning. So for those of you who haven't read the book, it is sort of split into certain themes. So there's the theme of the tafsir of Aisha, which is her exegesis of the Quran. And then there's the Fiqh of Aisha, which is her jurisprudence. And then there's the aqidah, which is her theology. And then there is her siyasah sharia, which is her political influence. And then there is the al-raqa'iq, which are heart softeners. And so under each of these themes, I've got anywhere from between 5 to 10 statements of hers. But I wanted the incident of the slander to be a standalone chapter. I really think that an entire book could be written just on the slander and the interpretations that one could, and the wisdoms and the lessons that one could extract from the slander. But I really, yeah, from the very beginning, I knew that that had to be a standalone chapter, and that that would be the chapter that I would end on. Because I think for especially women, there is a lot of strength to be taken from that story. This is very much a story of a woman who has been accused of something that she most certainly did not do, but that the people are inclined to believing, because who doesn't love a little bit of salacious slander? You know, I mean, is that not how the Sun is still running? You know, all these years later, that terrible tabloid. And everybody wanted to believe in that horrible lie about her. And I really, again, from my own experience and from the experience of the women around me, I'm convinced that, you know, we will all have had some shade of that experience. It may not be to the extremity that she experienced, but I do believe that we've all experienced to some extent that kind of wrongdoing or lies against us. And then this strength, you know, she really went within, you know, and this is after she's turned to her husband, no. She's turned to her parents, no. She's turned to friends, no. She is finding that all the people around her are not inclined to believing in her, because she is young, and because she is beautiful, and because she is the most beloved wife of the Prophet ﷺ. There are all manner of intentions that come to play from people as to why they would want to believe that she was capable of being, you know, being unfaithful to the Prophet ﷺ in the way that was being claimed. And so then she has to turn absolutely inwardly and dig really deep for a resilience and a wisdom that can only be reached through hardship and through contained and consistent reliance on Allah, such that even when the relief came, she didn't then go running back to the Prophet ﷺ. She stayed where she was because she knew that that was where she'd found Allah, and that was what was important. So the Prophet ﷺ just becomes a means by which she arrives to Allah. And that's why I believe she lived for so many decades after the Prophet ﷺ. In that moment, she's a different woman entirely. And there are no prophets after the Prophet, but there is Aisha.
Oh, what a beautiful line to end on. Thank you so much, Sophia. Just before we close, there was a question from Norma about what is the title of the book reference that's translated into English, please? You just mentioned it. Was it the tafsir of...
Oh, the Tarikh. So it's just the history of At-Tabari. So Al-Tabari. If you just type that in to Google, you'll find it online as a PDF.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. I want to recommend to everybody, Sophia does an online book club called Looking at Books Through the Lens of Islam and Gender. It's open to everyone around the world, and I highly recommend that you look for that. You can find her on Instagram at Sophia_reading, or if you just Google Sofia Rehman, I'm sure it will come up. Thank you so much, Sophia. It's been wonderful. There's still so much more. I'm sure, as we were talking before we started recording, I've definitely talked to you for another hour, but we will stop it here because we will have you back, inshallah, for when your next book comes out. I'm really looking forward to getting more into the nitty-gritty. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, everybody who's joined us this evening.
Well, my dears, we are going to take a break next month, but I will be sending an email out with the rest of the reads for the rest of this year. We are already into August in a few days' time, so do take care. Thank you so much for joining us, and yeah, have a wonderful summer. Much love.